Now that we've looked at the hypothalamus, let's look at the hormones of the posterior pituitary. Now remember, this rear posterior part of the pituitary gland is just an extension of the neurons in the hypothalamus. That's why the two chemical signals from here are going to be neurohormones. We looked at that in the previous video. You may have seen it there. So these two hormones from the posterior pituitary are called oxytocin, and then there's ADH. That's antidiuretic hormone. And since this posterior pituitary is just an extension of the hypothalamus, these chemicals are made in the hypothalamus, but they're moved down to the end of these axons, and then these chemicals are stored and released from the posterior pituitary. So don't get that confused there. But the first chemical we'll look at here is oxytocin. Now, oxytocin has two different stimulus for its release, and there's also two different target tissues. Usually, if you hear about oxytocin, it's at the time of labor and delivery. This is the chemical signal, at least the primary one, that causes the labor contractions. And here's how it's released. If pregnancy occurs, the baby will grow inside of a hollow muscular organ called the uterus. As the baby gets bigger, it will stretch the muscle of the uterus because the baby's inside of it. So as that baby gets bigger and stretches that muscle more oxytocin is released. Like other hormones, neurohormones in this case, goes into the blood. And when it gets to the smooth muscle of the uterus, it'll open up calcium channels, the muscle will depolarize, and contractions occur. So a very big one with labor contractions here. But another thing that can cause oxytocin to be released is a nursing baby. If a baby's nursing, oxytocin will be released at that time. Enters the blood, and when it gets to the smooth muscle around the mammary glands, it'll cause that muscle to constrict, also causing milk release. So two different stimulus for oxytocin, two different target tissues, two different effects. Now the other chemical from the posterior pituitary is the ADH, the antidiuretic hormone. It has two different target tissues, the kidneys and then also the smooth muscle around our blood vessels. We'll see a lot more of that on blood vessels in a future chapter. But ADH will target the kidneys and tell it when to hold water. You got to remember that roughly half your blood is water. So if at any time you're losing water, pressure drops. That's like losing blood. Anytime you're holding water, that's like holding blood, and pressure goes up if you put more and more water into the blood there. Same thing happens when you consume a glass of water, anything such as that. So most people have heard of a diuretic. Most people know that when you take a diuretic, you lose water, pressure drops. That's why diuretics are often prescribed to people with high blood pressure. So it makes sense that antidiuretic would decrease urine output. Holding the water raises the blood pressure up. So anytime your blood pressure is low, you release this hormone, and this is one thing the body can do to elevate your blood pressure. So this is shown right here, and more specifically what it does when it gets to the kidneys here is tell the kidneys to hold on to sodium. Sodium's the most abundant solute in your body. You hold sodium, water will follow it. That goes back to osmosis, covered probably on the cell in a previous chapter. So that's more specifically what it does. Tells the cells in the kidneys, we'll see those nephrons in a future chapter, to hold sodium. Also opens up these water channels called aquaporins that we'll see in another chapter. But that causes the body to hold water. You hold water, you're going to raise pressure. If you stop releasing ADH, you stop holding water, your pressure would drop at that time right there. Always think about just the opposite occurring too. But remember, in addition to the kidneys, ADH also targets the smooth muscle around blood vessels. That's why it's also called vasopressin, because it will constrict the muscle around blood vessels. Think about if a blood vessel constricts. If something constricts, you think of pressure as rising. You stop releasing ADH and it stops constricting those vessels, then they would relax and open. They would dilate, and that would drop pressure. So again, if your blood pressure is low, one thing your body can do is release ADH. That tells the kidneys to hold water, pressure will go up, constricts blood vessels, pressure will go up. If your pressure was too high, stop releasing ADH. Kidneys will stop holding water. As you lose water, pressure will drop. And if you stop constricting blood vessels and they dilate, in other words, get bigger, pressure will drop. Again, opposite always applies to this too. Now, the hypothalamus will know when to release this ADH by two different means. One is through the use of baroreceptors in the walls of some of the large arteries, like the aorta and the internal carotids. We'll see those arteries in future chapters. But what these baroreceptors do is detect stretching of arteries, right? If pressure goes up, their elastic walls are stretched more. You stretch those walls more, they send action potentials back to the brain more frequently, and the brain sees that high frequency as high pressure. If your pressure's too high, you want to get rid of some water. Stop releasing ADH, kidneys will lose water, that drops the pressure. At the same time, you stop constricting blood vessels, that'll dilate them, and they'll drop pressure too. And again, just the opposite always applies. So by measuring what your blood pressure is, I should say monitoring your blood pressure in some of these big arteries, that'll cause a change in how much ADH is released. Again, more ADH raises pressure, less of it will lower it. Here's the same thing right here. Got to remember that water balance goes hand in hand with blood pressure. That's very important. So there you see, blood pressure's low, release the ADH. Hold the water at the kidneys, constrict the blood vessels, all that'll raise it up. Just underneath it, you see exactly the opposite. But in addition to those baroreceptors in the walls of arteries, you have osmoreceptors in your hypothalamus. Now, osmoreceptors detect what's called osmolality. That roughly means the number of particles in solution. Largely what these are viscosity receptors. They're monitoring how thick your blood is. So if osmolality is too high, your blood's too thick. It's too thick because there's not enough water in it. So if your blood's too thick and there's not enough water in it, release ADH because that'll tell the kidneys to hold water. And that's what you need if there's not enough of it in your blood. And at the same time this osmolality is high, that's when your brain tells you you're thirsty. And of course, if you add water to your GI tract and absorb it across the wall into your blood, that'll thin it back out. And again, just the opposite would apply too. So there's the ADH and the osmolality. You hold on to water, consume water, that'll thin it and raise your pressure. And again, the opposite applies too. So read over all this information. It's in the typed up section, and there again are the links to my study guides. Make sure you get the right one of the two if you would like them.